Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. I'd like you to watch this very disturbing trailer of a very important documentary film called Hate Spaces.
Anti-genocide! Anti-Israel! Anti-baby killing! Anti-Israel!
The truth of the matter is, your days are numbered.
Long live the Intifada! Long live the Intifada!
AMP is arguably the leading BDS organization in the U.S. It is a key sponsor of the anti-Israel campus network known as Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP.
What if, as Muslims, we wanted to establish an Islamic state? What if, as Muslims, we wanted to use violent means to resist occupation? Is that wrong?
We support the Intifada!
We support the Intifada!
I'm tired of seeing the nail marks on my door from where the mezuzah was forcibly ripped from the wall.
It shook me up this morning, definitely makes me feel a little bit marginalized on campus.
What extent do we allow these student organizations to do what they do and get away with it because we don't want to show bias?
There is an incredible double standard on college campuses.
If this had been any other race, any other creed, these students would have been suspended.
The ideology has become that to be anti-Israel is to be truly progressive.
Any support of Israel is hate speech.
If you don't agree with them, you're against them, so they have to shut you down.
If there's no such thing as truth, then there's no such thing as lies.
It's very difficult to deal with a blizzard of lies, because you can always invent some kind of fiction.
The more that people attach themselves to ideologies that reject reason, that reject objective reality, the more likely you're going to see very aggressive anti-Semitism.
Chilling, isn't it? That's from the documentary film Hate Spaces, which takes you up close and personal to the insidious, vicious, hate-filled breeding grounds on college campuses today, which are virulently promoting a palpable hatred for Israel and for Jewish students, whether those Jewish students are actively engaged with Israel or not. There is a disease being spread on many college and university campuses today, including what once were bastions of tolerance and free speech and of human rights, that is today mindless, ignorant, intolerant, venomous bigotry and fascism, which is very often veiled expressions of classic anti-Semitism. Classic. We don't hate Jews. We just hate what Jews do, what Jews are. And they are Israelis. And Israel is an unjust apartheid regime, an occupying power, brutalizing Palestinians, denying their legitimate national aspirations for independence and statehood. Nonsense. Ignorance, bigotry, fascism. But it's what exists on some American college campuses every single day. In the public square and in the halls of academia, where professors intimidate students and squelch all pro-Israel arguments. And if you're unfamiliar with the scope and depth of anti-Israel hatred being spewed on college campuses today, there is a brilliant documentary you must see. Once again, it's called Hate Spaces: The Politics of Intolerance on Campus. And is produced by Americans for Peace and Tolerance, a nonprofit interfaith initiative founded by Charles Jacobs, whom you've seen many times here on JBS. And Americans for Peace and Tolerance is dedicated to promoting peaceful coexistence by educating the American people about radical ideologies that undermine the academic integrity at American high schools and universities. And the brilliant writer, director, and producer of Hate Spaces is a remarkable individual whose career has been devoted to defending the state of Israel and the Jewish people, especially on college campuses. Avi Goldwasser. It is such a joy having you at this table. I have wanted to meet with you forever, ever since I saw Forgotten Refugees. But let me tell you a little bit about Avi Goldwasser, extremely impressive history. Avi is the co-founder and former executive director of one of the most successful pro-Israel advocacy groups on campus, the David Project. And Avi is the executive producer of a number of outstanding documentary films, including, as I say, The Forgotten Refugees, the award-winning film about the plight of Jews from Arab countries, Columbia Unbecoming, a documentary about the intimidation of Jewish students at Columbia, and Northeastern Unbecoming, a similar documentary about a campus life at that Boston University. And thank you for coming here and sitting at this table. It is most gracious of you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the kind words.
They are only the tip of what should be said about you. I want to talk one moment about you, and then I want to talk about the film and films you've done. You told me you were born where?
I was born in Poland.
And at what point do you go to Israel?
I should say I was born in the occupied territories that were controlled by Poland after World War II. They were German. As you know, as a result of World War II, Poland was displaced 100 kilometers to the west. They had to give up part of the eastern part to Ukraine and Russia. And they took over part of Prussia. So that my parents, who were refugees, they survived the war in Uzbekistan. Long story to get there. But they were sent to the new territories, as they were called, where literally my parents arrived in a train to a small village outside what used to be Breslau, which became Wrocław. And as that train disembarked, all these Polish refugees, Jews and non-Jews, all the Germans of that little town called Lubawa were loaded onto that train and sent further west. They were ethnically cleansed. The Germans were from that territory and populated by Polish refugees from the part that was given to Russia and Ukraine. It's part of a massive dislocation of millions of people after World War II. I was born in that little village outside Wrocław, and at the age of 2, my parents came to Israel.
Where in Israel?
Well, they came to live in Ma'abarot, as they were called. There was no housing in Israel. Israel is a poor country.
What year roughly are we talking
1950.
about? 1950.
1950, and
infant state.
Infant state. I always tell the story that Israel was such a poor country that you can't appreciate it today. Today is such a wonderful miracle. That there wasn't enough food in the country, and food had to be rationed, and each family was allotted 1 egg per week. And as long as I was the only child, I got the egg. When my brother was born, one day my mother announced that he's getting the egg. I was not a happy camper. I've never forgiven my brother for that egg.
Is there just 2 of you?
That's 2 of us, correct.
What's his name?
Ken.
Where's he in life?
He's right here in Manhattan. My father passed away about 10 years ago. My mother, God bless her, she's 91.
Mazal tov, that's wonderful.
She went through hell, but she's amazing.
But did she go through hell?
She was not in a camp. like most survivors, it's all miracles to survive.
You are second generation.
I'm second generation. So my mother, through a long story, escaped to Russia, eventually wound up in Uzbekistan. My father was from Lodz, a major city. Long story, he went to a gulag as a British spy because Poland was an ally of England, and Russia and Germany were allied together. So,
was your father a British spy?
He never met an Englishman, never spoke a word of English. Doesn't matter. This is surreal. It's a Soviet system.
But it is surreal, isn't it?
Totally surreal. People do, well, you go to campus today, you see a new kind of surrealism.
Yes.
So he was basically convicted of being a spy for the British, sent to a gulag for a year. Somehow managed to survive despite losing all his teeth. And when the Germans attacked Russia, Poland was an ally. So he was enlisted into the Polish Free Army in Russia. It was the best time of the war. They gave him food, exercise. And he was supposed to go fight Rommel in North Africa. But the day the transport was leaving on the Caspian Sea to go to Iran with all these free Polish army, that then by truck they were going to go to North Africa to fight. Of course, many of the Jews were planning to stay in Palestine and not continue. Anyway, he got sick. He had an accident in the harbor, missed the boat, and there were no more boats. The Russia stopped supporting the Free Polish Army, and he was stuck in Russia, wound up in Uzbekistan, met my mother.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
But in a sense, he was very lucky.
All survivors were very lucky. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand how come he knew to run, where his 10 siblings didn't. He couldn't convince any one of them. And how come...
Did they survive?
One did. She survived Dachau. It's a whole other story. But they all perished. My grandparents, uncles, and so forth. And the reason he survived, the short answer, is because he heard Jabotinsky.
Jabotinsky.
Jabotinsky, he heard of him, he heard the story, and when the Germans came to Lodz, he could see it happening. He connected the dots, but he couldn't convince any of his family.
Jabotinsky warned European Jewry of the Hitler cloud and that Jews should leave Germany and all areas of Eastern Europe, correct?
He told them what was going to happen. The handwriting was on the wall.
He was prophetic.
He was prophetic, and I think it's an example of failed Jewish leadership. He was a lone voice out there.
What were your parents' names?
My father was Joseph. My mother's name was Clara.
Why do you smile?
Because she had many names. She was born Chaya, then she had a Polish name, Lucia, then it became Clara. Anyway, it's
And you call her?
Mom.
Mom, very nice. What's she like?
My mother grew up in part of Poland where it used to be Austria. My grandfather fought for the Kaiser in World War I. And she grew up in a sort of, middle-class family. Her father was a socialist, communist. They weren't religious. My grandmother was from a more traditional home. So she grew up sort of a mixed situation. They were in the bakery business. My mother worked since she could walk. And it was a typical sort of life in a small Austrian, Polish village called Przemyśl.
When your family moves to Israel, and now you and then soon after you have a brother, Ken, what's the tone of your home and what's the Jewish flavor of your home in Israel?
So my father came from a very Orthodox family.
Ah.
Right, he had 10 siblings. So his father was very Hasidic, scholar, all that. My father went to Cheder at the age of 3. My father had payas. I think the war changed him as far as that. He became more secular. So I grew up in, I'd say, mostly a secular home, but growing up in Israel, you imbibe Judaism. I think as my father got older, he went back to temple and he sort of reverted back to some extent to his roots. He was very intellectually inclined. I think he was someone that never had the chance to actualize himself, obviously. He became an accountant here, CPA.
Here, meaning in America?
In New York City, right.
When did your family come to America?
In 1959, we came to Brooklyn.
You remember?
Well, I just got to tell you, growing up in Israel as a child, even though we're materially poor,
yes,
it was a wonderful childhood.
Really?
We had no car, no electricity at some point, no telephone, nothing. But there was a spirit, a solidarity. As a kid, I could go anywhere. I wasn't afraid of anything. It was a wonderful childhood. I think well of it. I didn't realize what you missed till you came to America and you realize all the things you never had, but they weren't important. There was a certain feeling in Israel at that time, the pioneering spirit. And that's why when I go back to Israel today, I mean, I can appreciate America. It's unbelievable. And that's why it's so painful to watch people criticize. Compared to what? Israel's bad compared to what? What are you talking about? It's a miracle. It's an amazing miracle. And I know Palestinians, decent Palestinians, who recognize that this is a miracle in the Middle East. And it's a tragedy that other countries cannot learn the lessons of what the Jews accomplished. And they can make it a wonderful place in the Middle East if they only stopped hating. Stopped hating. So it was a wonderful childhood. Coming to America, like any immigrant story, it was difficult. My mother had to work, my father had to work, I had to learn the language. I came to Brooklyn, it was strange. I hated the winters, of course. It was a tough process, but it's no different than any immigrant.
Okay. And as the process goes on, at what point do you become comfortable? And Avi, do you at some point become an American?
Well, that's interesting because the initial impulse as a child was to run away, hide in a plane or a ship, and go back because you left your friends and familiar and unfamiliar. It takes a while. It takes a while. Maybe sometime in high school, you become more Americanized. Obviously, it's easier for me than for my parents, but it's your typical immigrant story.
Okay.
Typical immigrant story.
You ultimately wind up at NYU? CCNY?
So, yeah. So my mother being from Eastern Europe always drummed into my head, engineering is the way. Secure financial.
Yes. So
whether I enjoyed it or not, that's what I did. And she was right to some extent. In fact, she told me to go into computers. She never saw a computer anyway. I did go. I went to Brooklyn College, then I switched to City College. I got a degree in electrical engineering. But in City College already, I got involved in politics.
Really?
I was always interested in history, so despite being science and math major.
What kind of politics?
I was the president of the Jewish Student Union, City College. I was the editor of the engineering newspaper, Tech News. So I was already back then. College is an exciting time.
Okay.
Very exciting time.
I had the pleasure of meeting your wife, Noreen. When did she come into the picture?
Well, I went to travel in Israel. I actually went to study at the Hebrew University one summer.
In what?
Study at the Hebrew University.
What?
Oh, it was archaeology.
Oh, very nice.
I mean, something different in the summer than the usual math and science. And on that trip, I actually met her in Tel Aviv.
Very lovely. Is she a Sabra?
No, she was from Boston. And she was visiting as well. And like,
so a Brooklyn kid and a Boston kid go to Israel to meet?
It's more complicated. We met for a couple of days in Tel Aviv, then we lost contact until a year later we ran into each other at Columbia University where she was getting a master's.
Fabulous.
By accident.
And children?
We have 3 kids, wonderful kids. We have 5 grandkids, which is more fun.
Mazal tov, that's fabulous.
2 of them live in Israel. My daughter in Aliyah.
Really?
Yes.
Did that thrill you?
It did. She actually made Aliyah after she graduated college doing the Intifada, 2000 Intifada. So it was a very tense time.
Were you worried for her?
Of course I was worried for her. Every time a bomb went off, she called. And it was tough in that sense. But that's what she wanted to do, and obviously we supported her.
And the other 2 are?
One of them, both daughters married Israelis. Both daughters married Israelis whose father was born in Baghdad and whose mother were born in Bulgaria. Just coincidence.
What an interesting family tree you now have.
It is, it is.
One more question about you, and then I want to go to the movie. I've talked to people who are second generation. They often tell me how difficult it was for them as children because their parents wouldn't talk. And their parents carried with them a cloud. And it, in some way, affected them, their lives, how they view the world. To what extent is any of this true for you two?
So when I grew up in Israel, first thing you notice is that I don't have grandparents. Actually, I did have one surviving grandparents who stayed in Poland before coming to Israel toward the end of his life. But generally, it was like the norm. In fact, many people didn't have grandparents in Israel at that time. It's only when you come here, see everybody's grandparents. And you don't miss it till you realize what you're missing. It was always there in the background. I think my parents were reluctant, obviously, to talk about it. They sort of hinted at things, and as a child, you have limited interest in following up. You're too busy. As I got older, I became more curious, more interested. And then I read a book by Helen Epstein about second generation. I began to relate to what she was saying. I began to look at things differently because most of my parents' friends were also Holocaust survivors. So it was a kind of bubble that you don't fully appreciate. At some point, I think in my 30s or so, I decided to videotape my parents. I wanted to get their story. And I've been obsessed with it, obviously. As you get older, you understand it better. I went back to Poland twice. My parents thought I was crazy. Why would you want to go back to that place? They couldn't understand it. Well, I had to. I had to sort of reconcile.
And you had to because?
I had to understand it. I had to understand what happened, why it happened. I had to see it for myself. It's not a vacation. So I went with my uncle, my mother's brother, which was fascinating. My mother's brother is about 6'3", blonde and blue eyes. And so I went with him there, and he's not shy. And he used to confront people on the street, like asking questions like, why'd you do it? And anyway, it was, but he was
Do
very...
you feel you learned something on that visit?
Absolutely.
Those 2 trips?
Absolutely.
Okay, capsulate. What did you learn?
Here's the thing. So remember, I grew up with my parents' stories of their interaction in Poland. And the bottom line is that the hatred that they experienced from the Polish people was more painful than the less direct hatred to Germans. I could never understand how come they hate the Poles more than Germans. And I'm a little contrarian. It's got to make sense. So I went to Poland, and it's a more complex story. And the bottom line is that Jews lived in Poland for 1,000 years. They developed an amazing civilization, the Polish Jewish civilization. And that's why, yeah, it ended badly. There's no question. And there's a lot of lessons how it ended, why it ended that way. You know, Jews are not politically astute, let's put it this way. They're wonderful, moralistic people, but when it comes to politics, they're not that astute. Anyway, so it didn't end badly. But if you look at the total picture, I hate it when you go to the Holocaust Museum memorials, where all we talk about is the 6 million dead. I think it's a mistake. We have to talk about what was lost. You can't appreciate 6 million dead. You can appreciate the lost civilization if you know what was accomplished there. There's a new museum in Warsaw, which I plan to attend, of the accomplishment of the Polish Jewish civilization. Only then can you appreciate what was destroyed. So I met some wonderful Poles, really who are compassionate, high school teachers and other people, young people, who are trying to reconcile to the history. No different than Americans trying to understand what we did to African Americans or Native Americans. So there is some of that. There's also anti-Semitism.
Did it change the way you feel, either about Poles or?
Yeah, I think. Look, Poles are also victims, and they also have a cult mentality, victimhood cult. They were abused by the Germans, by the Russians. I mean, that doesn't excuse anything, but it's a more complex picture. I think what most fascinated me is the righteous Gentiles in Poland, a few thousand, who saved Jews and risked their own lives. Mm-hmm. I don't think I would risk my family's lives, my kids, for a stranger. They did that.
Remarkable, isn't it?
It is, and almost all of them were religious Catholics because they had faith in God, okay? Because otherwise it's an irrational act to risk your children for a stranger.
So did it change your appreciation of the Polish people as a whole?
It did. It's multidimensional. There's no question there's unnecessary anti-Semitism without Jews. I went back to the neighborhood my father grew up and lived in.
Yes.
I took pictures. Nothing changed.
Yes.
Nothing changed under communism. And there was a picture of a hangman with a Jewish star. There are no Jews. It's just a useful political tool to blame Jews. It's so ingrained to some extent. But there is a new generation. And it's a mixed picture. It's not perfect. It's somewhat painful. Poland is a giant Jewish cemetery. That's what it is. You're going to visit a cemetery. There's 1 million Jewish graves there. There are great stories. There's some great synagogues that are being refurbished by Polish artists. I saw Poles reconstruct the Lublin ghetto in a miniature as a way of capturing the place. Every person who lived there, every street is in this little model they created. So there are good Poles who are trying to deal with it. There's always the politics, and Jews as scapegoats is good politics sometimes in certain places, Hungary, maybe Poland. It's complex.
Okay.
It's complex.
You know, we could talk about this forever, but I want to transition. How do you go from engineering to filmmaking? How do you decide to create the David Project, which everybody should understand? It was a pioneer project in terms of the Jewish community and going onto college campuses, advocating for the state of Israel and trying to educate young Jews on campus to be able to better dialogue with people who were critical of Israel. But Avi, at what point, you know, do you make this transition, or how do you add it to your life?
Yes, so I transitioned from engineering to finance. I went to NYU, got my MBA, went to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers, spent 6 years in public accounting, and then I actually got a job as a financial executive to build an airbase in Israel.
How did that happen?
It's as you know, in the Camp David Agreement, President Carter agreed to replace 2 air bases that the Israelis had in Sinai by building them in the Negev. One air base was near Beersheba. The air base was near Eilat.
Okay.
And the company that was building the air base near Eilat was located in Framingham, where I was living. And I found out about it, and they were looking for a financial controller. And I got the job.
That's wonderful.
And I spent 3 years in Israel with my kids. It was a wonderful adventure and experience. We built an air base that's operational, obviously, today. And I had a chance to meet Menachem Begin.
What was that like?
It was amazing.
He was amazing, wasn't he?
You can read about him, right? He's a terrorist. He's a leader. He was the most charming man I met. Someone described him as like a Polish nobility. He had a certain touch and charisma. I mean, I spent 60 seconds with him. I was awed. I was awed.
Yes.
So that was a great adventure. When I came back, I went into high tech. I worked for a company that actually invented the internet.
You and Al Gore.
Everyone says the same thing. The internet was invented by a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, a Cambridge, Massachusetts think tank that built the ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And I worked for that company.
Doing what?
I was their ultimate chief financial officer. It was a New York Stock Exchange public company. I spent 14 years there. It was an amazing company. And one of the things we did is build the internet. Just because you build it doesn't mean you make all the money. But so that's what I did. And we sold the company in 1997 to GTE Verizon.
Yes.
And and I went to do some other startups. And I was between companies when my daughter and future son-in-law were in college. And things were happening, disturbing things. This was around 2002. And my son-in-law, who just completed the army in Israel, he wasn't my son-in-law yet. And he was at Northeastern University studying bioengineering. And he was being harassed, called baby killer. He was just trying to go to school and study, but in the quad, flyers in the class. It was annoying. And so he went to Hillel. He went to the school. Nothing was done. And he came to me and he challenged me. He said, "What's going on? Nobody's doing anything." None of the established Jewish organizations were really actively supporting the situation. So finally I said to him, "Well, I got to do something." because I was the president of the Jewish Student Union back in City College in 1970. So I've done it. So I got involved in the Jewish community. I went to some established organizations, gave them a business plan. Nothing was happening. And then one day I met Charles Jacobs. And I met Professor Richard Landis. And I met Tal Ben Shahar. And for the first time, I met somebody who agrees with me. Because growing up in a very liberal community in Newton, wonderful people, we just didn't agree politics. So they got it. They understood the problem. And I teamed up with Charles Jacobs. And we founded the David Project in his living room one day. And we had some wonderful Harvard grads, brilliant students, who Jesse Sage and others who helped launch a startup. I've done a dozen startups. This was another startup. And it was good. We're fortunate to find donors because nothing happens without donors. And that comes with support. But anyway, so I took sort of a business approach to the problem.
Interesting.
Which is, you have to go and understand what the problem is. Forget what you read. You got to get it firsthand. Because I had the time, I spent a year on college campuses. I just wanted to observe. I went to rallies, lectures. 1 month I heard Noam Chomsky in 4 different schools. MIT, Boston University, Tufts, some other schools. It's the same speech, of course, and it's the same silly speech in many ways. And it's astounding how people admire him because it's sort of nonsense, total nonsense. He has a certain formula that he uses over and over.
What's his message?
His message is, I think, typical sort of Marxist interpretation, which is the power differential analysis. Look at any situation. Forget how they got there. It's current state analysis. Strong, weak, you know what your moral responsibility is.
For the weak.
Always for the weak. Okay? And this sort of appeals to a lot of people. It makes sort of simple sense. And that's
it's very Jewish.
It's Jewish,
it's
and
very
it's
Jewish.
Simple logic. Simple logic, no context. So I tell you, I was actually doing work for the David Project in high schools in New York City. And I asked the students, what do you do if you see a fight on the schoolyard? There's one guy beating the other. Who do you support? The guy on top, the guy on the bottom? Everyone says the guy on the bottom. Why? It's the underdog. I said, what if I told you that the guy on top that's doing the beating is your brother? I didn't think of that. Let me think. Oh, still the moral answer is I have to support the underdog. Okay. I said, you know, in 1944, the Nazis were the underdog. The Russians were coming from the east, the Allies from the west. They were clearly the underdog. They were going to lose. Who do you support? Never thought of that. They had this simplistic notion, okay, always the underdog. I said, this is not a sports contest. This is life and death. It's not so simple. They never thought of it. These are brilliant students. Okay. So I spent time on campus listening to students, arguing with students, arguing with Palestinians and Arabs. And I concluded that the Zionist narrative has been totally deconstructed on campus. The Jewish students cannot defend Israel using the traditional narrative. What I consider the Zionist narrative on campus is that, 1, God gave us this land. 2, the Balfour Declaration. 3, the UN partition of the land.
You forgot the League of Nations.
Okay.
But they don't know about the League of Nations.
But those are, each one of them has been deconstructed. That is, if you say God gave me this land, the answer is God is not a real estate agent. I don't know what that means. If you say Balfour Declaration, the answer is, what right does a British lord have to give away my ancestral homes to the Jews? If you talk about the UN partition, they say, wait a second, the Jews bribed Ecuador, Guatemala. It's a rigged vote. Now what do you say as a Jewish student supporting Israel? You're stuck. That's what I meant. That narrative, that's what you're educated with in Jewish schools and so forth, has been deconstructed. So most Jewish students stuck. So instead, they switch over to, look how wonderful Israel is, nanotechnology, we help Haiti, medical devices. Not impressing people on campus, because on campus, there's a different value system. And that's the key. The value system that we believe in as Jews, as decent Americans, is one that's based on facts, logic, truth. The value system on campus today, for a lot of reasons that you know, is not based on facts, logic, and truth. It's based on feelings, compassion, equality, suffering. The highest value for Jews is life. The highest value for progressives is equality. Life is secondary, as every progressive communist country can show you. So now when you come in with our values and defend Israel, you're going to lose most of the time. And it's very frustrating. Okay? So that's what I discovered. Mm-hmm. And so we concluded, it's a David project, that we need to undermine the false Palestinian narrative. And the Palestinian narrative is really simple. I've been to these rallies. They don't have to study too much. They have no facts. They don't need facts. Here's a story that repeats itself. They train them in a simplistic example. They said, the guy comes in, it's a Palestinian from the West Bank. He said, my father was killed in 1948 by Polish Zionists. My mother's paralyzed after being shot at a checkpoint. And here's the key to my house in whatever, Haifa. End of story. Now go ahead, pro-Israel. Where do you start, right? So what we decided is we need to undermine an element. One element is, who are the indigenous people of that land? Everybody assumes it's the Palestinians. Everybody knows about Palestinian refugees. No one knows about Jewish refugees. Not from Poland, not from Brooklyn, from Arab countries. Indigenous, clearly, to that region. So that's why we decided to create a speakers bureau of non-Ashkenazi speakers. We don't want to bring any government officials totally discredited on campus. Another Ashkenazi Jew, forget it. Scholar, rabbi, no good. We brought Joseph Abdul Wahid, an Egyptian Jew. Right? And when you bring him to school and you promote that he's going to talk about the Middle East, everyone assumes he's an Arab. And sure enough, when he speaks, he says, Salam Alaikum, speaks in Arabic, and then he says, Yahud. And people look puzzled. How can he be Jewish? In fact, there were 2 Egyptian students when he was at Harvard who said to him, wait a second, I thought all the Jews left Egypt with Moses. They never knew there was a Jewish community.
I don't understand how that answers any of the very powerful emotional arguments you made on behalf of Palestinians a moment ago.
It was a
my
step.
father
It was a
was
step.
killed. My mother was paralyzed, and here's the key to my father's house in Jaffa, which you evicted me from, and you stole from me. And Ari Shavit writes a book, My Promised Land, the cradle of which is, we definitely needed this land, but it belonged to somebody else. We destroyed a people, and we stole a people's land. The fact that you've got a Jew from Iraq doesn't speak to that at all.
I agree. It wasn't meant to.
Okay, so you told me a very powerful, you set me up. There's a very powerful, I'm saying to myself, yeah, Avi, how does the Jew effectively answer, you killed my father, you paralyzed my mother, and here's the key to my house.
So
tell me how you deal with that.
Okay, I was answering your previous question as to what we did at the David Project.
Yes.
And that was the first step. We had to reframe the discussion of the conflict.
I don't know how it does that.
Well, let me tell you. So we had a speakers bureau, and then it was too expensive to bring speakers in. Joseph Abdul Wahid was the chief economist, Wells Fargo Bank in San Francisco. So I decided to do a short video, and that short video, I met a filmmaker in Israel, became The Forgotten Refugees. And we've screened it in many venues, 7 languages, and it had an impact. It had an impact, first of all, on Jews who didn't realize that there are non-Ashkenazi Jews.
Absolutely.
It had an impact on people who realized that the problem is more complex. It's not just simply Palestinian refugees, that you had Jewish refugees, okay? So it was a way of providing deeper understanding of the conflict as opposed to the cartoonish Palestinian narrative.
Yes.
But that was a step 1, to create some doubt on the other side that it's a simple story, European colonialist and so forth, okay? It doesn't answer your question, but I was describing what we did at the David Project. That was step one. And the use of film, which is why I got into films, I never did films, I have no background in film, was we felt it was a more effective way to communicate to people than another op-ed, another thing to read. Young people like music, like flickering images, and it worked. It really worked. I can tell you that tomorrow I'm screening Forgotten Refugees, 10 years after we made the film, to Israeli Americans in Boston. I screened it in many venues.
And everybody feels they've learned something.
Absolutely, because it's an unknown story. I was
Correct.
shocked that no one did the story.
Correct.
Okay?
Okay. But it doesn't answer the very powerful challenge that is being made to Jewish students on campus. But it's not just that. Anybody who listens to you understands that that's the problem that we face. There is a story about the underdog, and the underdog today, unbelievably, has become the Arab. Not the Arab, by the way, the Palestinian. And Israel is the Goliath. I want to know how you help kids deal with those three arguments.
Okay. So I can tell you what we did at the David Project, and I can tell you what I think needs to be done. Those are not necessarily the same thing, because
what you did at the David Project does not address that. You address something else.
No.
I vote to you. I want you to address the problem.
I will, but just let me explain. So Charles and I left the David Project.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons.
Were they institutional? Is this did you have to leave because the Jewish community is crazy?
So let me tell you why we left, as opposed to answering this. So one thing we did, again, it's a small organization, limited resources. We did the film, it was a success, got a lot of traction. Then we did another film called Colombia Unbecoming.
Yes.
And this was an attempt to expose what the other side is doing, okay? As opposed to playing defense. We concluded, certainly, that Israel is too wonderful. Why do we have to defend ourselves? Why are we always on trial? This is absurd. In fact, when you engage in that discussion, you validate that perhaps there's something wrong. I don't think we need to defend Israel. This is seriously. I think we need to expose the other side. So when my discussions on campus, people said the Israeli army is the most brutal occupying army. I said, really? Compared to which army? The Russian, the Egyptian, the Pakistani, the Chinese, the French? What are you talking about? In the history of the world, give me one army that's more humanistic than the Israeli army. In the history of the world, not just today. Of course they have no answer. Because as soon as you name an army, I'll tell you it's a dead army or it's not humanistic at all. So Israel's not perfect, for sure. Nothing is perfect, okay? They always criticize Israel when they compare it to some ideal army in their head that doesn't exist in human history. Now, they believe it can. Well, until it does, don't judge Israel. Compared to what is a simple answer, okay? So we, in fact, educated students on campus how to go on the offense, because facts won't change anybody's mind, okay? Because if truth mattered, there wouldn't be BDS against Israel, maybe against Lebanon, Syria, who really mistreat the Palestinians. So once you realize it's not about facts, and you can't cram so much facts into the student's head, it bounces right off. So the first question is, compared to what? And we developed a methodology called ARM, how to answer any questions without knowing all the facts. Okay? It's not all the facts on one foot. You're never going to understand all the facts. But you can ask me any question, and I can always respond. I'll never be silent, using ARM, which is address, reframe, and send your message. When you tell me, my father...
Say it again. ARM is?
Address.
Address.
You have to answer the question.
Yeah.
Reframe.
Reframe the question.
But get your message out.
Right.
It's all about airtime.
And message.
It's all about airtime. You got so many seconds to get your message. So now going back to your example. The guy said, my father was killed by Polish Zionists. Well, the response is, your father was killed. I'm sorry. War is tragic. Bad things happen in war. I'm sorry. However, the real issue is transition, reframe, the message. Right? Israel wants peace. There's a dispute. How do we live together? You want to go back in history? It's a waste of time. Here we are. There's 8 million Jews, whatever, so many Palestinians. How do we live in peace? And I asked the question, do the Palestinians want peace? Simple test. How many songs for peace are there in the Arab world? Not one. I'm still waiting for one song. I'll tell you about the most popular song in Egypt a few years ago, I Hate Israel. If there are no songs for peace, no peace movement, no clamoring for peace, how do you know they want peace? And if they don't want peace, what's the point of negotiating? On the other hand, you know how many songs for peace there are in Israel? Thousands. So you tell me who wants peace. Or you want to go back, rehash 1,000 years, 100 years of who did what, Deir Yassin or this. Doesn't matter. Here we are today. What would you like to do? Do you want peace or not? Okay? So anyway, we developed these techniques of how to argue, how to go on the offense. Because you stop defending yourself. You can't answer the question, why do you beat your wife? Okay? You can't prove the negative. Okay? So that was one thing we did, and it's still being used to a fair extent. And it's not rocket science. Every politician does it. They never answer the question. Right? You say, oh, that's an interesting question, but, and then you get your message out. Always get the message out. So that's what we did. But
is there an overarching message?
I think the overarching message is always, what are the facts? What's the truth? And what do you want to do today? I'm not going to rehash the history. Here we are today. Ask any honest Arab, would they rather live under Arab rule or Jewish rule? Palestinians are the luckiest Arabs in the world. Occupation is no fun, whatever you want to call it. Rule over by someone else is no fun. I agree. Israel has tough choices, bad or worse. And you can second guess the government every day, but they have to decide for themselves.
The answer that you get is that while there may be songs for peace in Israel, you have a prime minister and a right-wing Knesset that does not want peace.
Here's my answer. It doesn't matter who the prime minister is. It doesn't matter what the Knesset thinks. It could be Herzog, Tzipi, or Bibi. It doesn't matter. You know why? Jews don't determine what's going to happen in the East. There's 400 million Arabs, 8 million Jews. Excuse me? The Arabs decide. They want peace, there's peace tomorrow. They don't want peace, there won't be peace. It's absurd to think that Israel has the power to decide. It doesn't. I heard of course Israel wants peace. Israel has nothing to gain from continuous conflict. Okay? The Arabs don't want peace because they don't think they can gain what some of them want. It's complex. I've been to Jordan, I've been to Egypt.
Jordan made peace with Israel.
Peace comes when not just the leaders sign an agreement, it's when the people want peace, live in peace and cooperation.
Is that true? I thought it was the opposite.
Well, eventually, otherwise the leader can disappear tomorrow.
And Sadat did disappear, but he made peace first. And the Egyptian people did not want peace.
They still...
And they still do. But there is.
But you know, you have to take a long-term view, right? Peace can be ephemeral. So I think Sadat is one of the heroes of the 20th century by far. I mean, he was an amazing individual. I think King Hussein, the father, was amazing. And there have been amazing leaders.
Has there been an amazing leader in the Palestinian community?
Don't think so. Don't think so. But look, I think that the tragedy of the Middle East, the tragedy of the Arabs, is the failure of the leadership of the Arab world to help the citizens adapt to modernity. These are failed societies. Every Arab society is a dysfunctional society. And that's a tragedy. They mistreat their women, minorities. It's tribal. It's a bunch of alpha males dominating each other, vying for power. It's sad. It's sad. It's a tragedy. They can't adjust to pluralism, inequality, the basic modern things. And as long as Arab societies function that way, there cannot be peace. The leader may be more enlightened or less enlightened, but the society is not stable for peace.
Do American administrations understand what you just said?
I would say they haven't in the past.
How is that possible?
Because, as you understand, okay, people tend to project themselves and people tend to have a certain ideology. Americans have always been, to a fair extent, idealistic, okay? And somewhat egalitarian in their outlook. And they project it to others. Because some of us may think we're superior, but most of us say, look, other people can achieve what we've achieved, if they're helped, generosity, all that stuff. It's a kind of fantasy about human nature. that is prevalent in the Jewish community, and it's kind of an American positive trait, this idealism. But when it crosses a line into fantasy, there are consequences.
Okay. I say this to myself all the time, and I say it to people who sit in your chair. It seems so clear. It's so clear that the Israeli people and that the Israeli government and the Jewish people since 1938 have said over and over again, yes, we will share a land we think should be all ours. Yes, we will share a land that the League of Nations gave entirely to us. We'll still share it. And there's an Arab world that every time the Jew has said that has responded, over my dead body. Now it's that simple, Avi.
I agree.
And yet, Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, not one state that I talked to a senior official who's been inside the halls of government and diplomacy, and he doesn't see it. How is that possible? And by the way, what I'm asking you also, and you should speak about this now in general, you heard my open. To what extent is anti-Israel, in your opinion, veiled anti-Semitism?
Okay, so just to answer your
yes,
first question, please. It's hard to know someone's true motives, right? Who knows what they really think? We know what they do, but so it's speculative. I think George Bush was idealistic when he invaded Iraq. Somehow we thought we can bring democracy and there would be a turning point in history. Obviously, we know better. It's not that simple. But I think there's a tendency to sort of project our values into others, both in terms of we're all humans, you know, the usual cliches, where in fact all cultures are not equal. America is an exceptional country. It's a unique country. And most countries may not become America as much as we'd like the whole world to sort of copy our model. They're copying our economic model, but not necessarily our political model. So there's a kind of idealism, wishful thinking, and a kind of faith in progress that we're all converging on some world peace. Policymakers in Washington balance ideology, idealism with pragmatism and other. You can't underestimate the influence of Arab oil. It'd be a different situation if Arabs didn't have oil and the amount of money that's pouring in to influence American politicians, American schools, and so forth. We can only hope that lessons are learned and that the obvious finally is articulated. I mean, that's the most painful thing. It's an absurdity to talk about a two-state solution today when one side teaches their kids to hate and kill. It's not peace. It's an interim step to actualizing what the real agenda appears to be among many of the Palestinians and so forth. Qatar is pouring billions into hatred of Israel. Qatar is pouring billions into American schools. Why do we let that happen? Not to mention Al Jazeera. Okay, so there is a kind of absurdity that you don't know. Are people so blind? Are they so there's a kind of denialism for a lot of reasons, psychological reasons that I can't fully explain.
And that was part one of my meeting with Avi Goldwasser, writer, director, and producer of Hate Spaces, The Politics of Intolerance on Campus. I hope you join us for part two of our discussion. And I do hope you enjoyed meeting a very lovely and committed Jew who's making a real contribution to Jewish life today. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'Chaim, either by Avi Goldwasser or by me. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I love hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
Foundation of Jewish Education in Media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.